Hello, everybody. Welcome to this presentation. I'm Peggy Sundstrom, and I'll be your host for this presentation entitled Transit-Oriented Development and Gentrification, a case study examining the cultural effects on a historically Black neighborhood in Denver, Colorado. And this will be presented by Dr. Genene Duran, who I have had the pleasure of knowing for quite some time, and I'm very open throughout the presentation, and we invite you to post your questions and comments there. The last 5 minutes of this session will address those questions and any thoughts that you may have about Genene's presentation. Let me tell you a little bit about Genene. Genene grew up in Northeast Denver in the Montbello community. She holds a doctorate in human services, a master's in healthcare administration, and a Bachelor of Arts in communication. In addition, she's also a certified mediator and has a certification in public relations as well. She's currently the assistant director of the Allied Health Department at the Community College of Aurora, as well as an adjunct professor in the department. Dr. Duran is vice chair of the board of Denver Department of Public Health and Environment, the vice chair of the advisory board for the City and County of Denver's Agency on Human Rights and Community Partnerships. She sits on the board of directors for the Women's March Denver and serves on the Denver African American Commission. I don't know where she has any time. Although she has accomplished a great deal, she remains most proud of her 17-year-old son and 16 and 13-year-old daughters, who I believe are in the background listening to her presentation. Dr. Duran's greatest passions include providing a voice for underserved communities and affecting positive change through leadership, strategic planning, relationship building, change management, community outreach, community engagement, and organizational training. Dr. Duran, we're ready for your presentation.
All right, thank you. Over the past 25 years, transit-oriented development has been occurring in the historically Black Five Points neighborhood in Denver, Colorado, because of the development of the Regional Transportation District's, RTD's, first light rail in 1994. Gentrification and the displacement of existing neighborhood residents has directly correlated with the in-migration of white people back to urban neighborhoods. The impetus for white people to move to these communities quite often has been the result of the revitalization of the neighborhood that has taken place due to transit-oriented development. Definitions of terms include community of color, which is a neighborhood in which most of the residents belong to a racial or ethnic minority. Gentrification, which is when affluent individuals moved into working class neighborhoods while historical residents are simultaneously displaced. Gentrification of existing communities is arguably the most significant social impact of TOD because of the displacement of residents that occurs during the process. Internal colonialism theory examines the oppressed status of ethnic and racial groups in their own homeland that lay within the boundaries of a bigger municipal dominated by a different majority. In transit-oriented development is mixed-use, compact development adjacent to transit facilities and high-quality walking environments. Gentrification that has occurred within the Five Points community is continuing and is directly related to transit-oriented development. Factors such as housing density and land value have historically been associated with TOD, and studies have shown that properties near transit stations appreciate more quickly and at higher rates than those not adjacent to rail stations. In addition, TOD has also been positively associated with the high value of residential properties due to their proximity to transportation and the new amenities which become available in the neighborhood. In addition to the obvious displacement caused by gentrification, there have been other negative impacts for African American populations. From 1990 to 2018, the Black population in 5 Points decreased 24%, while the white population increased 58%. Multiple Black-owned businesses have closed. There was a decrease in economic mobility, a decrease in affordable housing. Grant funding for nonprofit organizations has also been threatened. Studies have shown that gentrification, which has which occurs because of transit-oriented development, has been known to have disproportionately negative effects on minority populations. CON 2007 examined the development of light rail and commuter rail lines in relation to gentrification. Sample averages of demographic data from 1970 showed that neighborhoods in which park and ride or walk and ride stations were built had higher poverty rates, higher population density, higher rates of bus utilization, and a closer proximity to the central business district when compared to like neighborhoods in which rail stations were not developed. CON 2007 presented evidence that Black populations were disproportionately affected by new commuter rail stations when compared to the demographics of similar neighborhoods in which rail stations were not developed. The purpose of this study was to understand how the culture of the historically Black Five Points neighborhood in Denver, Colorado was impacted by transit-oriented development and gentrification. The general problem was addressed, was that the potential problematic cultural changes amongst the African American community were taking place because of transit-oriented development and gentrification in the Five Points neighborhood. The cultural changes were problematic because the premise was that the influx of white residents into a historically Black community would have caused the traditional values and social norms of the neighborhood to change. It was believed that the social networks, community durability, and overall quality of life for those who remained in the gentrified community may have been negatively impacted. What was unknown was to what extent the culture of the historically Black Five Points neighborhood had been affected by TOD and gentrification. This research study was framed by the following research questions. What were the experiences of tenured Black community members who resided in the Five Points neighborhood from 1992 to 2018? According to the tenured Black community members who were not displaced due to gentrification, what major cultural changes occurred within the Five Points neighborhood from 1992 to 2018? What were the perceived impacts of the cultural changes to the neighborhood on tenured Black community members who resided in the Five Points neighborhood from 1992 to 2018? And what kinds of programs and services would have been helpful to support Black community members who resided in the Five Points neighborhood from 1992 to 2018 through the culture changes that have occurred? There was an extensive literature review that was conducted in which transit-oriented development and gentrification was researched, and both positive and negative consequences were found. Positive consequences included a strengthened economy, environmental benefits, increased property values, and increases in the development of affordable housing. Negative consequences included gentrification, displacement, racial transition, and a decrease in public transit access. Policy development and community benefits agreements were potential solutions. Internal colonialism theory was the conceptual lens to assess the cultural changes that occurred because of gentrification. Developed in the 1960s, internal colonialism theory was used to examine the subordinate status of a racial or ethnic group in its own homeland within the boundaries of a larger state dominated by a different people. Internal colonialism theory was considered in theory and in practice as it related to the occurrences in the Five Points neighborhood because of the significant and inherent role played by race relations, policies, and economics. The theory contributes to the comprehension of the cultural, economic, and social suppression suffered by African Americans, Native Americans, and Mexican Americans in the United States, as well as the ethnic regions of Europe, post-slavery, and colonization. The section on cultural preservation addressed topics such as racial division, intersectionality, attitudes and values, and effective means of cultural preservation. To conduct a thorough analysis of the topic and to ensure method triangulation, the study drew primarily on in-depth qualitative interviews with community residents. However, secondary data such as systematic observations of the presence of 3 factors within the neighborhood and historical U.S. Census Bureau report data, which spoke to the drastic change in demographics within the Five Points neighborhood from 1992 to 2018, were also analyzed. Data from this study revealed that the historical Black residents in Five Points community have been dominated economically, socially, and culturally by the new white residents in their neighborhood, thus creating racial tension. The economic, social, and cultural changes that occurred within the Five Points community because of the white newcomers to the neighborhood are congruent with what one would expect within a situation of internal colonialism. Study participants did not report any common themes about their political experiences within the community. Data from the interviews were analyzed through transcription, coding, and examination for clear themes with MaxQDA text analysis software. There were 5 major themes and 1 sub-theme identified during the text analysis process: disruption of community connection, cultural displacement, race relations, impact of light rail, and financial resources were all primary themes, with cultural preservation being a sub-theme of cultural displacement. The most prevalent theme found within the study was disruption of community connection. This describes the experiences of community members as they have contended with the gentrification of their community. The historical businesses they had grown up with closed, lifelong neighbors moved away, and properties were sold to the highest bidder. Multiple participants stated that the culture of their community was significantly impacted as restaurants, which once provided ethnic cuisine for African Americans, closed. Participants discussed no longer having a place to commune with other community members after church and for special events. In addition, participants discussed the importance of going to places within your community and everyone knowing each other and at least exchanging pleasantries with one another, and how truly impactful it is when those connections no longer exist. Cultural displacement spoke to the social differences experienced by the tenured Black community members who continue to remain in the neighborhood post-gentrification. Multiple participants stated that they felt as if the new white people to the community were attempting to obliterate the remaining historically Black culture of the Five Points neighborhood and instead infuse the community with their own white values. Although closely related to some of the sentiments regarding disruption of community connection, which describes what had already been lost, cultural displacement and its sub-theme cultural preservation had some distinct differences as they were used to explain the aspects of the community that were currently being lost by community members. The second largest segment coded in the study was race relations. Multiple study participants discussed tangible changes to the Five Points neighborhood that have resulted from the influx of white people to the community over the last 25 years. Several participants discussed noticing how policing changed in the community, and that once increasing numbers of white community members arrived, there seemed to be a desire to protect them. Saying hello, caring for property, and equitable education opportunities, as exemplified by access to school funding and access to school transportation, were also notable points of contention between tenured Black community members and white newcomers, as reported by participants. In addition, participants stated that once the neighborhood saw an influx of new white community members, amenities such as scooters, bike lanes, and dog parks became prevalent within the neighborhood. Participants stated that when the Regional Transportation District opened a light rail through the neighborhood in 1994, it caused additional gangs and drugs and violence to be transported to the community more easily. According to many study participants, the RTD light rail in their community was poorly planned and well known as the route to nowhere. Light rail construction caused many businesses in the Five Points community to go out of business due to inaccessibility during construction. Participants further explained that transit-oriented development began to occur, which then led to gentrification in the community. The introduction of light rail has resulted in a significant demographic shift in the neighborhood and prominent cultural changes for long-term Black community members who continue to remain post-gentrification. The primary suggestion provided for the services and support that would have been helpful to support tenured Black community members who have resided in the Five Points neighborhood from 1992 to 2018 due to the cultural changes that have occurred was financial resources. Programs and services for Black community members who have remained in the gentrified community were deemed necessary by multiple study participants. Financial resources for both individuals and small businesses was a reoccurring theme. Systematic observations were used to further triangulate data. Observation locations were randomized by using locations that were adjacent to the interview locations chosen by study participants. The presence or absence of 3 factors were recorded during observations by assigning a point value of 1 if the factor existed and 0 if it did not. Factor 1 was the presence of new residential or commercial construction. Factor 2 was the presence of a historical business within the immediate vicinity. Historical businesses were defined as being established in the neighborhood since at least 1992 and were identified either by asking business employees or by using the 5 Points Business Directory. Factor 3 was the presence of interactions between Black people and white people which were not initiated by business transactions. Totals were calculated to determine the frequency with which the factors were present. Results indicated that factor 1 was noted 15 times, factor 2 was observed 15 times, and factor 3 was seen 1 time. Each of these findings from the personal observations aligned with the accounts from the experiences of community members discussed during the interviews with study participants. From 1990 to 2018, the Five Points community experienced drastic demographic changes. The Black population in the neighborhood started at 36% and is now 12%, while the white population started at 19% and is now 77%. The US Census Bureau data supported the accounts by study participants of the culture changes that have occurred in the Five Points neighborhood from 1992 and 2018, and that as more white people moved to the community, the original Black communities who were not displaced did experience the tangible effects to the community of the demographic shifts. Results of the study indicated that tenured Black community members who still reside in the Five Points community post-gentrification have been dominated by the white newcomers to the neighborhood in multiple ways, including economically, socially, and culturally, however, not politically. Cultural naturalists argue that political change is followed by cultural change. Thus, it could be argued that political dominance is imminent within the community. Furthermore, while social subordination seems to be occurring due to the sheer number of white newcomers to the community and the mass exodus of African Americans, data indicated that psychological subordination amongst tenured Black community members had not yet been achieved. Internal colonialism theory postulates that once a population has been dominated, cultural, economic, political, and complete social and perhaps psychological subordination may potentially occur, and the extent of domination varies by factors such as the presence of multiple ethnic groups, gender, time, class, and locale. Findings from this study were in direct alignment with internal colonialism theory studies conducted by other researchers. Colonialism is comprised of cultural domination, political subjugation, racial exclusion, and economic exploitation. There were some limitations of this study. First, the limited sample size meant that participants interviewed for the case study were not representative of the overall tenured community members within the Five Points neighborhood. This was a limitation to the study because the first 12 people to meet the requirements of the study were interviewed. Second, The Five Points neighborhood was the only community examined within the study, so the generalizability of the study is of question. Qualitative analysis was used to collect a substantial amount of information about a small population, and the resulting evidence about the issue being studied may or may not be applicable to other communities. Next, residents interviewed may not have been fully able to recall events and time sequences of changes over the past 25 years. Participants were asked to discuss the chronological order of the changes that occurred within their community. The data collected reflected participants' overall impressions. Finally, the demographics of Denver, Colorado are unique in that the city is predominantly white, yet has concentrated populations of African Americans in several neighborhoods within Northeast Denver. The implications for theory and research are that two forms of gentrification of communities were evident in the literature. Either middle and upper class African Americans moved into waning Black neighborhoods that were undergoing revitalization, and existing community members remained and absorbed increased housing costs, or as in this case of the Five Points community, the influx of upper class or middle class whites to the communities of color due to TOD caused the displacement of existing community members due to increased housing costs. Internal colonialism is arguably a direct result of this type of gentrification. Tenured Black community members who remain in their gentrified neighborhoods post-gentrification will most likely experience seismic changes that are congruent with internal colonialism theory. Internal colonialism results in negative impacts to those who have been colonized, although the colonizer may reap extensive benefits. Recommendations for further research include: how do tenured Black community members and new white newcomers interact, and what is the nature of these interactions? What has the experience been like for white newcomers as they have gentrified the historically Black neighborhoods? And finally, how have those who have undergone internal colonialism preserved their culture post-colonialism? These questions are relevant because it is important to understand the true impacts of internal colonialism on those who belong to both the majority and minority groups. In addition, how populations which have been dominated successfully preserve their cultures should be further explored.
Genene, I'm going to interrupt you right here because we just have a couple minutes left, and there are a number of different comments in the chat. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. There's a theme here that perhaps you can address, which is that these findings are very interesting, very enlightening, and they should be presented to community groups. Do you want to take just